Hi everyone. Welcome to our fourth lecture. Uh, what we're going to be focusing on today is going to be late medieval life. So we've moved beyond the High Middle Ages, and now we're going to be talking about life during the late 13th century, so late 1200s, and particularly focusing on the life in the medieval universities, as well as the rise of the commercial revolution and some of the problems of the late medieval period. Okay, just like with the last lecture, what I would like you to do is pick three of the terms that I mentioned and place these terms within the overall theme of the lecture. So one paragraph answers for each, and then please do an additional paragraph response to a discussion post mentioned by one of your fellow classmates. Thank you. Okay, here are the terms. Commercial revolution, first term. Medieval guilds, second term. Apprentice is the next term. Journeyman, second term. Master craftsman, which is the next term. Medieval universities is our next term. Scholastics, the next term. St. Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas. Summa Theologica, Summatheologica. Trivium, Trivium. Quadrivium, Quadrivium. Next term, typical life of medieval students. Next term, troubadours, Troubadours. Our next term is chaste love, Chste, love. Next term, bawdry love, Bawdry, love. Our next term is Arthurian legends, Arthurian legends. Next term, Little Ice Age. Next term, Great Famine. Next term, Black Death. Next term, Bubonic Plague, Bubonic plague. Next term, Pneumonic Plague, Pneumonic. Next term, Dance of Death. Okay, well, one of the things that most stands out about the late Middle Ages, so as we're entering kind of the end of the 1200s, is we see for the first time kind of an interest in the rise of towns. So before this point, almost everybody's living in the rural area. They're living within that feudal system that we talked about, the majority of people being serfs. Now, for the first time, we begin to see a few people leaving the medieval manners and instead moving into the cities. The cities are going to offer opportunities and a different type of life than what was available in the manors. Okay, for the first time we see basically people moving into the towns. We see new groups of people that never really existed out in the rural areas. For example, we begin to see artisans, we begin to see merchants. These towns are small towns that are going to be the predecessor of cities. So some of them become larger eventually and become actual cities. These towns are walled in, kind of like we talked about before with the, common in the ancient world. Now we begin to see the same thing here in the late medieval world. So the towns are walled in, and the walls both keep people out and also keep others in. One of the main reasons for the towns is going to be the fact that that can be a place for commerce. More people come into the towns. People in the towns have more jobs. People with more variety of jobs also have more money, more discretionary money to spend. And then you're going to have people selling them items. So for the first time, merchants. Okay, now you're going to see basically what's going to control town life is going to be what are called guilds. Guilds. A guild was a medieval union. And these medieval unions basically controlled the various crafts and the various crafts and the various responsibilities expected of people in different commercial industries. So there'd be, for example, a carpenter's union, spinner's union, and basically these crafts were broken up. These guilds were very structured. They were based upon the idea that there were essentially 3 different levels. Okay, you would start off as an apprentice. One of our terms is apprentice. So apprentice is the beginning person in the guild. It's someone just learning. It's kind of like a gopher who does the grunt work. So they would carry the craftsman's tools. They would bring the craftsman water. They would learn about the craft from their master, who's going to be called, the master craftsman, the person that is the expert in the field. They would not be paid for it, and they would usually live in their the master craftsman's house for 7 years. After 7 years, they would begin to learn more detail about the craft. They would have more responsibility, and they would become, after 7 years, usually an apprentice would become what's called a journeyman. So they would remain a journeyman for 7 years. They would get more skill. They would get gradually more and more responsibility, do more and more work, more detailed work. And then after 7 years, they would become a master craftsman, an expert in the field. So the journeyman, one of our terms, is kind of between the apprentice. So it's 7 years after an apprentice and would do more detailed work. Then after 7 years, they become our next term, the master craftsman. The master craftsman could charge more money for their work. They would do more intricate designs. They would do more, they could charge more for their services. So all this is, these medieval guilds or unions were very regulated by the medieval guild. And the medieval guild, there were like heads of all these medieval guilds, and they were some of the most important men in the medieval towns. They were kind of like right beneath the town mayor. So a very powerful position to have. Now, basically, what you're going to see is with more people coming into the towns and more things being bought and sold, there's eventually going to be what's called, our next term, a commercial revolution. So a revolution in commerce, a new way that things were bought and sold. What's eventually going to happen is the buying and selling of goods is going to become very specialized. Different places become known for different things. For example, Saxony becomes known for fine wool. If you want fine leather goods, you would go to Florence, Italy. So different places became known for different type of goods and became kind of the center for these different type of goods. Now, with different varieties of goods and different places specializing in different goods, what's eventually going to happen is there's going to be commercial fairs. So kind of like the World Fair that we're going to see in the 19th and 20th century in Europe and in America, there's going to be a fair every year. There's going to be a commercial fair for about 3 months a year. And it's going to change. It's one time it will be in part of Italy, another time in France, another time in England, another time in Germany. And people from all over Europe are going to go there. And for 3 or 4 months, they're going to be selling their goods. So kind of like, in our own society, we have every fall the Renaissance Fair. People go to the Renaissance Fair from all over the place, and there you sell Renaissance goods, specialized handcrafted goods. Well, we're going to see the same thing here. So now with these new commercial fairs, there's going to rise a need for new type of jobs and new types of skills. For example, with people coming from different areas, you're going to need people to keep tax records to make sure that people are paying taxes on the goods that they're producing in the town or the place where they're holding the fair, is keeping track of that. So you need people that can keep financial records. Now you're also going to see different currencies. So you need people that can exchange currency. So in one place it'll be a German coin, and that has to be translated into somebody else is paying with a French coin and someone else with an English one, and you need somebody to basically make these exchanges. So later on in the 20th century, this becomes the bureau de change, where you would take one kind of currency and then it would be changed into another one. So you want to go to Britain and you don't want to bring American dollars. You want to change them into British pounds or into euros. Well, there's a currency exchange. So you need somebody to be able to do that, to do the arithmetic and keep the records. You also need people who can translate languages. Because if someone's speaking in English, they're not necessarily going to understand German or Italian, but you need somebody that can speak different languages as a way of facilitating commerce. So there's a need for new types of education that never really existed before. And that leads us to the rise of the medieval universities. So medieval universities become developed as part of the late Middle Ages as well. And they're going to be brought into being largely because of the commercial revolution. Now, some of these medieval universities I'm sure you've heard of. Some of the famous medieval universities are as far back as the 13th century and into the 14th century. Some really early medieval universities you've perhaps heard of would be Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, which is the University of Paris, Notre Dame. So these are some of the early universities. There's also some Italian ones that are, today less famous. The University of Salerno, the University of Bologna. Well, why do you think it would be Italian universities would be so early? Well, as we're going to see when we start talking about the Renaissance, Italy is the trade route between the East and the West, and basically it's going to be the center of commerce. And, basically the Italians are going to replace the Arabs that we talked about back in the 8th century with or the 7th and 8th century with the rise and spread of Islam. So what's going to replace it by the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century is going to be Italy. So Italy, the trade route between the East and the West. And of course, the reason why Italy is going to become the center of the Renaissance as well is because of the papacy, the Roman Catholicism, which is the only Christianity really, or the major form of Christianity in Western Europe at the time. So all that money coming into the church. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the things that what it's like to live in the medieval university. Well, first of all, the medieval universities, you're going to see that the people teaching at the university, so their version of professors, they're going to be referred to as scholastics. So that's another term, scholastics, S-C-H-O-L-A-S-T-I-C-H. I'm sorry, rather C-S-C-H-O-L-A-S-T-I-C-S. Yeah, that was right. Scholastics. So that would not be what you're studying, but rather would be the people who are teaching you. So the scholastics become the medieval professors. Now, the books that the professors write are going to be referred to as summa. So a summa, S-U-M-M-A, would be a scholarly book written by a medieval professor. Now, the type of courses that students are learning. Well, what they're going to be learning is going to be what's called the trivium and the quadrivium. Now, this is kind of interesting. Trivium means 3, quad, quadrivium, 4. So together, what do they become? 7. Well, the trivium and quadrivium become the 7 classic liberal arts, the foundations of a classic liberal arts education. So here's what they learned there in the late medieval universities. They would learn the trivium. The trivium would include grammar, rhetoric, and dialect. So, how to present words, how to write them, how to make arguments. They would also learn what's called the quadrivium. The quadrivium would be arithmetic, music, more advanced arithmetic like geometry, and astronomy. So what does this sound like? Sounds like the classic liberal arts, which would be the liberal arts and sciences. So these would be the type of things that people would learn there in the medieval universities. Okay, now first of all, the life of a student was a bit different than the life of a student today. First of all, students didn't have to take any exams, and they didn't have to go to class. They would only take an exam at the end when they felt they were ready to be tested for the knowledge to get their degree. Professors would teach when they felt like it, and nobody would have any books. Why would nobody have any books? Remember, books had to be written by hand, so nobody would be able to afford books. Now, the people going to the medieval, late medieval universities were going to be coming primarily from the upper classes. Nobody else could really afford it. Students would live in what's called the Latin Quarter. The Latin Quarter is sometimes called the Bohemian Quarter or the Student Quarter. Where you really see this shown very well is in the opera called La Bohème. So La Bohème, the Bohemian, looking at the life in the student quarter or the Latin quarter of Paris. Okay, now how about today? Do most people like to live near frat houses which have a lot of students? If you answered no, you're right, but why? Why this conflict between what they call town and gown? Well, because basically students and non-students are living different type of lives on different types of schedules. Students may schedule their courses so they don't have to get up till 11 o'clock. So they can go to parties the night before and then, gradually make it into the beginning of the day. Well, do most people that have to get up at 6:30 and get their kids off to school and, get them on the school bus, are they really going to want to hear people partying late at night until 4 a.m.? No. So there's a lot of conflict between, the student area and the non-student area. And what they did in the medieval period was they would have them in their own separate quarter of the city. So the famous student quarter. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the life of the medieval professors. Okay, well, the medieval professors, as I said, they were called scholastics, and the scholarly books that they would write were called summa. Now, the most famous late medieval professor is going to be someone by the name of our next term, St. Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, his famous book is one called our next term, Summa Theologica. So Summa Theologica, Summattheologica, it means the scholarly book dealing with theology. And theology was seen as the most important subject that one could study. It was, based on, Aquinas' book was based on the relationship between faith and reason. And Aquinas argued, St. Thomas Aquinas argued that you need both. Some things can be understood rationally. You can understand them by thinking about them and they make logical sense. Other things do not. But he says that does not mean they do not exist. It just means we are not able to understand them. We don't have the ability to understand them. So he says the only way that we can understand certain things is based on faith rather than reason. So we need both faith and reason, as he argues there in the Summa Theologica. Now, for the late medieval world, the Bible was everything. The Bible had all the answers. So they would use the Bible as the absolute proof behind everything. So what would they do to offer proof? They would say it says in a certain chapter of the Bible, a certain page, so and so and so and so and so, and that would be seen as proof. Well, somebody would ask one time, well, how do you know the Bible's true? Here's the answer that they basically gave. They say, we know the Bible's true because the Bible says the Bible's true. Well, would that work today? Would that make much sense? No. What kind of reasoning would we call that? We would call that circular reasoning, offering as proof something that hasn't been proven. It's almost reminds me a little bit of like a mother who tells her kid, don't do that. And what would the normal kid say? Why? And what does the mother answer? Because I said so. Well, that's just a power play. That's not really offering any proof or any real reason for anything. So basically the Bible was the ultimate authority behind everything. Some of these late medieval professors, they would get into very big arguments, just like we would see in the academic world today. People are arguing, for example, nature versus nurture. What influences people more, their genetics or their environment around them? Well, in the late medieval world, one of the big bones of contention was how many angels fit on the head of a pin. Now, why would that be such a ridiculous thing to argue? Well, let us count the ways, whole lot of things. But that was one of the things that they would argue, back in the medieval times. Now, professors would lecture, students would take notes. After about 4 or 5 years, students felt ready to get their degree. Then they would ask the professor for an exam. He would create an exam. If they passed it, they got the degree. If they didn't, they would keep taking the exam until they passed it. They would also include oral exams. So, the thing about an oral exam, and this is still a big part of graduate education at the PhD level, an oral exam, you can ask follow-up questions. You can really tell very quickly whether the person knows something or doesn't, because if they say something but don't give enough information, you can ask a follow-up question to see if they, really know it. So they would have to pass an oral exam before they could get their degree. And, this would basically allow them to get a degree, and then they would be seen as an authority. Okay, now let's start talking about a little, actually, particularly today, a very scary side of late medieval life. Some of the very tragic and horrific events of the 13th century, the 14th century, the 1300s, that are going to lead into the Black Death or the plague. Okay. Now, basically, you're going to see that during the 14th century, there's going to be something called, our next term is Little Ice Age. Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age basically took place between 1300 and 1315 to 1322. And basically what happened was there were 7 years where the temperature was extremely cold, where it was beneath the average amount of warmth in the society. And it's going to ruin a lot of crops, causing a lot of people to become nutritionally stressed. The problem with becoming nutritionally stressed is you're not able to fight off disease and even colds with the same way that you could before. I believe we talked about that back in the ancient world when we were talking about Egypt. Okay, so this little ice age is going to ruin the crops, causing a lot of in some places actual starvation, but in other places people to become weak and nutritionally stressed. Now people are remember, they're living in a very religious society, and really understood their Bible and believed it to be the ultimate truth and ultimate authority behind everything. So they're looking for biblical answers behind everything, and they're going to say this is biblical prophecy, that there's going to be 7 lean years. People had less energy, less productivity, which allows them to grow even less, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. Things get worse and worse. There's also going to be an event called the Great Famine during the first half of the 14th century. So our next term, the Great Famine. Now, during the Great Famine, as much as a third of the population of France, and it was really centered around France, about a third of the French population died because there was just not enough food to go around. Now, in France, between the years 1302 and the years 1348 is historically significant because that's the start of the plague. There's going to be, within those 46 years, 20 bad harvests. So it's not just an occasional bad harvest, but frequent bad harvests. Places where the harvests were particularly bad, people abandoned entire villages. People just moved and moved to different places. There are bands of homeless people going from place to place looking for places to live. During this time of great starvation and economic deprivation, you're going to see, for example, a lot of marriages being postponed, which is going to lead to a decrease in the population. And that's traditionally, historically been the case. Think of the generation of the baby boomers. The baby boomers are the years 1946 to 1964, and that's going to be the time when things were going very well in America, so people had more children. Then there's the generation right after them called the baby busters. I'm part of that generation, and that's 1965 to 1976. So at that time, people had fewer kids. Okay, now when there's bad times in one area, it's going to lead to bad times in other areas because various areas are interrelated. So when things go bad in one place, it's going to affect the economy somewhere else. So there's fewer people to buy and sell goods, economic hard times, recessions, economic depression. So just a horrible time to be alive in medieval Europe. Now, people are also going to become more and more desperate. When times are bad, we see it unfortunately today in the way that people are aggressively stockpiling not only hand sanitizer, but even things like toilet paper. So people that would normally, be, not even think about it, suddenly become very aggressive. That's my toilet paper, don't you touch that. Well, that's sort of what's happening here. Things are getting worse and worse in the first half of the 14th century, and people are getting more and more desperate. They don't know what to expect. They don't, have any idea what's ahead of them. They don't have really any safety net to try to make things better. And many people, it's going to seem like Armageddon, like the end of the world. At the same time, people are also going to want to look for a scapegoat for that. Now, who do people never blame? Well, I think most of us never blame ourselves. It's easier to blame someone else. It's the government. It's Obama. It's Trump. It's our parents. It's the baby boomers. It's the millennials. Well, at this time, they're going to blame the Jews. And Jews have traditionally been the scapegoat in Western Europe for almost the last 1,500 years, and unfortunately it hasn't gone away. People are going to even blame the Jews for poisoning the drinking water. They're going to say these Jews are just trying to kill off the Christian race. Now let's talk about the Black Death or the plague. Okay, well, first of all, the Black Death is the name for both. Okay, our first term, or our term here, our next term is the Black Death, and the Black Death is going to basically include both the pneumonic and bubonic plague. Okay, let's talk about the bubonic plague first, or our first term, and then the pneumonic plague, which came slightly after. Okay, so the Black Death is going to basically wipe out a good part of Western Europe. The plague is going to first hit Sicily in the year October of 1347. From Sicily, it then went north to Venice and Genoa, and it hit there by January 1348. It then went throughout the rest of Italy. From there, it went to Germany, France, and Spain, and reached England by the middle of 1348. In 6 months, this Black Death had basically made it all over Europe, destroying, killing numerous people, with actually killing close to 40% of the population in certain parts of Europe. All right, let's see how it spread and what comprised it. Well, the first one, the first part of the Black Death was the bubonic plague. Okay, the bubonic plague was a disease that came from the stomachs of fleas who lived on black rats. Okay, so there were rats that were in the ships. All ships have rats. As soon as the rats hit port in Italy, remember Italy, the trade route between the east and the west, as soon as the ships hit Italy, the fleas jump off of the rats, the fleas bite the people, and they get the plague. So in parts of Italy, as I said, about reaching about 40% of the people, the fleas transmit the disease. Now, in the towns, we also see the second part of the Black Death, which is our next term, pneumonic plague. Okay, as suggested in the name, pneumonic, or what the word where pneumonia comes from, that's going to be passed on by people spraying each other. Just like today, in social distancing, we're trying to avoid contact between people because they're afraid people are going to be, who have the virus are going to spread it to others. Of course, not intentionally, but by sneezing, coughing. Well, that's exactly how the plague was spread. So the pneumonic plague, people passed on from basically passed on to one another by spraying. They coughed, they sneezed, other people got it, and it basically wiping out whole areas. At the same time, people were nutritionally stressed from the Great Famine, and caused by the Little Ice Age, and this made them more susceptible to disease and less able to fight it off with natural immunities. At the same time, one of the big problems of town life, although it offered a lot of things, one of the things that was problematic always about lots of people living together was, problems with waste disposal. Waste was both human and animal waste was dumped in the streets. Homeless people with sewers are living in the streets. Houses in the cities and towns are very close together. And at the time, it was not uncommon for 6 people to share one bed. It was a way of keeping warm. Some houses didn't even have beds. That was seen as kind of a luxury good. Oh my God, you have a bed. Because most people were just living in blankets on the ground. At the time, your average person would bathe about every 6 to 8 weeks. Now, what kind of covered up their smell was actually these very strong perfumes. So perfumes were not originally invented as a way of making people smell good or attracting somebody, but rather were a way of hiding your natural body smell. So, imagine what somebody, would smell like without washing for 6 weeks. Other problems were germs from diarrhea. People rarely washed their hands when they had diarrhea or went to the bathroom. In the manners, what you would do, you would have meals. You would then basically hold your hand out and let the dog, lick your hands clean. So wipe your hand on the dog. Poor doggy. But here in the towns, they're the germs from the diarrhea. People not washing their hands before preparing food. Many people are going to have already fleas and body lice on them. And of course, if you get an infected flea, you're done for. Okay, how did they know somebody was going to die? Well, the first thing is they would get a boil, a puffy inflammation. This boil would hurt a lot because of all the pus in it. Then they would start getting black spots, which were bleeding, which existed under the skin. Then the person would start coughing very heavily, spitting up blood, and Shortly after, usually a couple days later, the person died. The people smelled awful as their body was decaying, and people believed that the disease was in the air. They just had that horrible stench. Now, people are going to want answers for this. Scientifically, they didn't have any answers. They really didn't understand at all what was happening. So they're going to look for answers. And, what are they going to do? They're going to want to blame somebody. Well, the group they were most likely to blame were the Jews. They're going to say it's the fault of the Jews. The Jews are, trying to destroy the Christians. Now, the plague was basically only happening in the cities because people were very close together. Just like in a family, sometimes if one person gets sick, they're going to be sharing a lot of the same things. They're sharing the same space, and they're going to pass it on to other members of the family. Now, what's going to happen is out in the manors in the rural area, people didn't get it. So people were noticing people in the cities are getting it, people in the towns are getting it, but people in the rural areas are not. So they're going to want to come up with an explanation for that. And one of the explanations they're going to come up with is that the people in the towns are greedy, decadent, non-religious, sinful. So God is punishing their evil, bad behavior. It's going to be the same kind of logic that you're going to see among some of the some people after Hurricane Katrina. They're going to say New Orleans was a sinful place where a lot of sinful acts were going on, and God was punishing the people of New Orleans by bringing Hurricane Katrina. So basically, 700 years later, the same kind of faulty reasoning. Now, the Muslims were actually very smart. The Muslims, they had one person who got infected. What they did was they quarantined that person, so segregated him, separated him from everyone else, and basically the disease did not spread. Well, does this have a familiar ring today? What's happening? Why are we all at home learning via computer rather than in the classroom? Well, basically the same thing. They're trying not to spread the virus. Okay, now the sad part is the plague was going to return between the 1860s and the 1870s every few years, but never as strong and never as deadly as before. People after so many people died after the Black Death, the people left were strong and healthy, and there was enough food for them, so they were able to more readily fight off the plague. Finally, the plague is going to die off for the first forever after the year 1721. So, fortunately, never to return again. Okay, so basically, now let's talk about what happened after the plague. Okay, you're not going to have a horrible thing like that where so much of the population dies, all this horror going on. You had so many people dying that there were actually, people carrying wheelbarrows full of dead bodies, saying, bring out your dead. Monty Python did a humorous skit of that. There was the scent of death in the air, and basically people just not knowing what to do. Now, basically, what's going to happen is the people reacted to the plague in two vastly different ways. One group of people basically started atoning to God. apologizing to God, trying to say, God save me, and apologizing for the sinful acts and the sinful things they did in life. And there's actually this movement where people started beating themselves, with a whip as a way of showing their atonement to God and showing they were truly sorry by enduring pain. Other people reacted in a completely different way. They engaged in Roman-style orgies, basically feeling the end of the world is near. There's nothing you can do at this point. They might as well enjoy every last moment they can of hedonistic pleasure. So people reacting in different ways. Now, the artwork of the time is also going to show a lot of this, the strange feelings that people had and this preoccupation with death. The book of the Bible that people were most reading and most infatuated with and constantly trying to understand was the last book of the Bible, the end of the Bible, called Revelations. So they're kind of looking at, what's going to happen in the end. In terms of art, there's going to be an interesting type of artwork called our next term, the Dance of Death. And what the Dance of Death was a bunch of kind of a chorus line of skeletons with a demonic-looking face, kind of pulling each other into the ground and pulling a live person into the ground while pointing, showing that this is where this person is going. So kind of chilling and horrifying.